Hey, how's it going? In this video, we're going to briefly talk about Storybook. They recently released version 7, which has a lot of awesome features in it. And I just want to walk you through how to set up Storybook for, our React application, for example. It does work for other frameworks. It's pretty agnostic. So you can see in the documentation, it supports Vue, Angular, even some stuff like Embers, Felt, and some of these newer ones like Quick. By the way, if you don't already know what Storybook is and what it's used for, at a super high level, think of it as like a way to develop components in isolation. So instead of you having let's say you have a running application and you want to add a new widget in there, right? Usually you might have to create the page and the route, and then within that page, you got to set up some layouts, and then eventually you start having a space where you start building out your new widget, right? And then within that widget, it might have subcomponents. Storybook allows you to do somewhat of the inverse approach where you just start on your widget in pure isolation. You don't need a page, you don't need a running application. You just write stories, which are representations of your component. So your component might have different variations, visually or in terms of behavior. And Storybook allows you to develop those again in isolation, and also kind of helps you create documentation for all of your components. So imagine you're trying to create maybe a component library, a design system. Storybook is very useful for those use cases. All right, so let's go ahead and get Storybook set up. But before we can do that, we actually need to set up an existing project that Storybook would sort of latch onto. So you can see in their documentation that, the Storybook initializer itself is actually designed to run off of existing projects. So what we'll actually do is we'll create let's pick Vite. Vite is a great way to build modern React application nowadays. So we'll do npm create Vite at latest. So on my desktop over here, I'll do exactly that, npm create Vite at latest. I'm using node 18. Let's provide a project name. I'll just call this Storybook demo, and we'll do React with Typescript. And there we go. Let's open this in VS Code. All right, so we got the code open here. There's a lot of red squigglies, I think because we need to first actually install the dependencies. So do npm install in the terminal if you're trying to follow along. All right, so with our application created, what we're going to do is we're going to run this command npx storybook at latest init, which is basically what it's going to do is it's going to take a look at your project and figure out what type of project is this, and it'll automatically set up Storybook for you for the most part. So you can see here that it detects the project type. It knows we're using Vite, so it also sets up Storybook to use Vite. I believe if you're using like Webpack, for example, with Create React App, I think it's also going to run on Webpack. And then it also sees that we're using React, so it adds whatever necessary plugin that you need to use Storybook with React. And then it might ask you to install a couple other optional things, like for example here it's asking me to perhaps we want to use the ESLint plugin. I'll hit yes for that as well. And there is a little note here about Storybook migration. If you started from v6, or maybe you watched my older Storybook video and you want to upgrade that to v7, they do have this tool that you just run npx storybook auto migrate, and it'll just figure out what code needs to change and what things need to be installed, and it'll do everything for you automatically. And it's a very, very good experience from my experience, right? And you can see here that it says we just need to run npm run storybook. So that means it added a npm script for us in package.json. Let's go ahead and run that. And you can see that by default it's running on localhost 6006, and then it'll come with a couple initial examples that we'll actually maybe play around with. All right, so if you've never used Storybook before, let's quickly walk through the UI just so you know where things are. Obviously at the top there's a search bar so you can find things easily. So based on the name of the component, for example, or the name of the story itself. And then below that you'll see that you have this navigation for the individual stories that you have. You might have some kind of grouping element here. So for example, you see all these stories are under button, and I'll show you how to do these kind of different organizations, how you can nest things if you wanted to. But typically what happens is you'll have, for example, here a set of stories per component that you have. So for example, here they have button, and they're showing the different variants of this button where they might have primary, secondary, large and small. And then And then there's this thing called docs that's actually very useful. You can see that it kind of groups together all of the individual stories that you have into one doc page. So you can actually see, as I scroll through this, it shows you all those stories. It shows you a way to view the code so that it works as a documentation for, hey, I want to get this variant of the component. I want to use this. There's some code there that you can copy, and it also documents the props. And you can even play around with these props dynamically, right? So if you wanted to kind of test how it looks with different text, for example, or maybe different colors, right? And this is assuming that your component has this API to change the look and behavior. This is just documenting basically what you have. And same thing, maybe you want to add descriptions to the prop API that you have. Again, the documentation capabilities of Storybook is just very, very useful. Now, within each individual story, you also have stuff here that allows you to zoom in and out. And then over here, you have tools like being able to change the background color. You can add custom background colors. And I find this extremely useful for scenarios where perhaps I'm developing a white box and I just want to see how that looks in different backgrounds, like a dark background, right? So for example, I might just do something like that. And there's support for adding grids, which is really useful for understanding the scale and the size of things. You can simulate the different layouts. For example, maybe you have mobile, tablet, right? Different viewports. You can customize it up here. This one is actually really useful. It's like a ruler that allows you to measure the different spacing and padding and margins and stuff that you have in your text. So for example, here you can kind of see, that there's 20 pixel padding left and right, and like roughly, 11 top and bottom, right? So here's another example of that with the header component example that they have. And then they have this outlining thing that allows you to sort of show boxes around the component boundaries that you have, which is also very, very useful. So you can see, each of these boxes might be individual divs or some kind of wrapping element. Now moving on to this bottom panel here that you can see in individual stories, there's usually this controls thing, which is very similar to what we saw in docs, where you can kind of play around with the dynamic things that's coming into your component, like the props. And then there could be actions. So for example, if you want to track events and stuff, you can see here that they have actions attached to the click event. And in the third tab here, interactions, is for interaction testing. It's actually something that just recently came out, I believe, with V7. You can now do interaction testing. It's very similar to like unit testing, except you're able to do it on a real browser visually. I believe there is an example here with logged in. Very simple example, but if you had more assertions here, you can actually step through your individual assertions. So this is a great way to, again, test your different interactions for your component. All right, so that's the UI in a nutshell. There's a bunch of other things in here, but that's really most of the ones that you need to think about. Let's go back to the code and show you how to write these stories. All right, so back in VS Code, let's talk about some of the files that you need to care about. So first of all, you should expect to see a .storybook directory, and that's going to have a lot of your storybook configuration. So for example, main.ts here, but you can see that it documents and configures how to look for stories. So for example, here it's looking for any file that has .stories in the file name within src. Again, we're not going to touch this file too much in this video, but it's important to know where this file is so that if you need to reconfigure or change things, you know where to go. So let's quickly talk about what we're going to try to build, maybe something really simple that just showcases how to use Storybook and why it might be useful. So imagine that perhaps we're trying to build like a traffic light component, like imagine a traffic light has three different lights, the red, green, yellow. All right, so let's create a new component. Let's call it, let's start with maybe the individual lights, right? So we know that has 3 different states. Let's just call it light.tsx, right? And let's initialize that to be an empty React component. And then immediately I'm going to add a new file as well that is the story representation of this component. So let's do light.tsx stories.tsx. And remember, in our main.ts config, it's looking for that configuration, right? So that's why the naming convention is like that. All right, so first thing we're going to do in our story file, we're going to import the meta and the story object type from Storybook itself. Next, we'll import the light component itself. And then at the top of every story file like this, there's usually some meta configuration at the top. That's why we have this type meta. So we'll do const meta, and it's going to have type meta of the type of our component, right? So it accepts a generic there. And then make sure to export default the meta as well. And then one of the things that you need to provide here is the component itself. So we'll provide light. Let's provide a title. So we'll do, let's just call it light. And that's usually the bare minimum that you need. There are other things that you can configure that I'll maybe talk about in this video. But once you have that initial meta of what is the component that we're writing stories for and what is the title, you can add the type for each individual story, and then you can then start creating stories. So for example, let's do a base story here. And then usually you want to provide an args object in here, which is actually going to be the props that feed into your component. But first, let's run Storybook and see just what this initial configuration is providing for us. By the way, something extremely important is make sure that you export every story that you write. Otherwise, Storybook will not be able to find it. So if you're wondering why your stories aren't showing up, it needs to have at least one exported story for it to actually show up in Storybook. So back in Storybook, we should be able to see a new grouping here of light, and then it has base for our initial story. So if you click on that, you should just see this thing that just says light, because that's all our component is doing as of right now. All right, so at this point, we have our initial story set up. We've got our component set up. Now we can actually start developing with Storybook. Again, you don't need a running application. We can kind of just make our changes here, and you should see your changes reflected in the story, right? So our intention is to, again, create some kind of traffic light component. So let's go ahead and start building that. So for example, maybe let's start with a green circle to represent a green light. All right, so maybe let's start with adding 20 pixel padding. Let's do a background of green, border radius of 50%, add a width, and then we don't actually need some text in there, so we can probably get rid of that, and a height of 20. All right, so now we got a green circle. And using the tools over here, I can verify that the sizing that I used is as expected, right? That maybe you're comparing with a Figma design file. It's saying that the content box, the blue box in the inside of it, is a 20 by 20 box as we coded here, and then it's got 20 pixel padding around it, right? So in reality, we could probably just simplify this to let's just do 50-50, no padding, right? Because there's really nothing in there. So we've got a green circle, pretty simple. So we're talking about building a traffic light. So this component has effectively 3 different states because it has 3 different variants. So in our prop, let's do variant, and let's say that we have green, yellow, or red. Structure that, and let's say it's initially by default a green variant. Let's just provide that as a value over here. Right now it's the same, but imagine that, okay, I want to test the different variants of this component. I want to test the yellow and red. How do we do that? Well, in the story, we could pass in an args here, and it's going to feed that as props to our component. So for example, we can do variant red, and you can see that it has some IntelliSense here. So it's working off of the TypeScript type of our component, and it'll know if you're passing in a correct type. So for example, if I add like a non-existing type here, it's going to tell me, hey, that's incorrect. Anyways, now we've got our red dot here. right? But the better thing to do is to probably just create a new story for that variant. So let's copy this twice. Let's call one yellow, red, and the base really can be empty. We can say that the variant is optional, right? So now we've got three different stories, base, yellow, and red, and now it represents those three variants of our component. And notice how the yellow is a little bit hard to see against the white background. That's why this color switcher thing, the background switcher, is very useful. So now I can put it against a dark background and I can see that yellow a little bit nicer. All right, so that's pretty much writing stories in a nutshell, right? It's very simple. You just export an object and optionally provide args as basically your props. There are other scenarios where perhaps you want to create a custom render, so maybe this API doesn't work very well for you. You can do something like this. So let's do another story, and instead of providing the args object, you can provide a render which has the args in it, and you can actually just render your custom component in here and spread in the args. Right, so that creates another story, and if you wanted to, you can still provide args in addition to that, right? So maybe we want to do red. See, so now we've got the red light on the right here, and of course, if you wanted to, you could just define the props directly, like so. And this is very useful for cases where maybe you want to see how your component composes together. Like let's say if we had a grouping div of some kind. So maybe we had a grouped green, yellow, red, or I guess red would be at the top, right? So we're starting to see sort of like a group of lights becoming an actual traffic light. And let's add a little bit of styling here. Right, so maybe we'll put them in a flex container with a border, and let's add a little bit of padding. Right, so you're starting to see sort of a traffic light. So this container itself could probably be its own component, its own story, right, that composes lights within it. But you can kind of see how we're starting to develop a component from the ground up, from the individual lights up to the things that composes those components, and then you could build up to the page that would actually contain that. All right, so we just covered how to do a custom render function. What else can we do? So something that you'll notice is in the other components like yellow, not on base, but on yellow, the controls here actually has an input box for the variant here. So I can actually change it right here if I wanted to. So this is sort of a way that Storybook allows you to play around with the component directly, and it figures that out based on the args that you provide. So for example, if I provide args on our base here, let's just do green, we should see the same thing with our base component. Our base story here now has that control too. But the thing that doesn't work super great here is technically I can pass in whatever I want in here, right? So for example, maybe I passed in pink. Right, now we have a pink light, which technically is not supposed to be allowed, right? Because we only have 3 variants. It doesn't support pink. So one of the things you can do to improve the documentation here for your controls is you can add arg types on the meta object here, arg types. And this is a way for you to further document the props that you have. So for example, we have a variant prop, and we want to say that the control for this, instead of it just being an input, we'll say that it's a radio, and we can provide options like green, yellow, and red. And actually, sorry, we had a typo here. This is not a boolean. You're supposed to do type radio. So now on the right side, you should be able to see radio buttons for your different variants, right? So that's very useful. And you can even use a select if you want, and that gives you like a drop down option. So that's another thing. right? And going back to the button, remember that we had, for example, these things, right? Like they have like this toggler, they have a text area that allows you to provide different text. There's checkboxes for, not really checkboxes, but a color picker. There's radios, there's selects, right? So there's different types of controls that you can use to document basically your component prop API, right? And you'll see that defining the arg types up here updates the configuration for all of your stories. So now all of our stories have these controls. All right, so that's arg types. Another thing I want to cover real quick is the ability to add a docs page like this one we had before with the button. How do we do that? Pretty easy. On our meta, we're just going to add a tags property here, and we'll add auto docs. And that's actually something that is configurable again in the main.ts. Remember, there's docs here, auto docs, and it says that basically anything that has the auto docs tag, any story file that has that, will automatically have a docs page. You can configure this to be enabled for all of your stories if you just pass in a true here, for example, right? So now on the right side, you'll see that there's a new docs page here, which, as the name implies, it effectively documents our stories in a single page, which is very useful for component libraries, design systems. And again, it has those code things. It's got the different controls here and our individual stories all in one page. And then remember, from the buttons example, there's a lot more stuff in here, right? Like descriptions and stuff like that. A lot of that just comes from comments, actually. So for example, if we go to our light.tsx in our props type here, if we just do some description, and then while we're here, let's also add a comment here, actually, some comment about my light component. Now, one gotcha is that this is not going to automatically show up on your storybook. For some reason, I found that you have to restart the server. So I'm actually going to kill the storybook server and rerun npm run storybook. And then when it runs again, you should see in the docs page, now it says some description down here, and then also our comment for the component itself. And then even in the stories themselves, actually, you can add some comments in here, like, right? And again, you'll probably need to restart the server. Let's do that. And that's going to add comments in your individual stories, right? So now you can add custom descriptions as well per story, which is very nice. So hopefully you're starting to see how this works. Again, not only as a place where you can develop your components in isolation, but also as a way to document your prop API, the different variants of your component. That's why it's very useful if you're creating a component library, a design system, or just in general, right? Think about how many components you create in an application. How many of those things are really not documented until you just kind of ran into the code and have to read the code to understand how it works. Whereas Storybook just allows you to have a nice catalog for all of those things. A really good example actually is Airbnb has a public storybook out there that you can take a look at. I think this is still running on the older version of Storybook, but you can see how they have like everything pretty much documented on how it looks. They've got their buttons, they've got their cards, they've got the different interactions here, like, oh, this one's clickable. You got toasts, right? So in a more sophisticated example, you could have literally a searchable catalog of your entire component set for your application. So that's pretty much Storybook, really, the base fundamentals of it that you need to get started. That's really all you need. The only other thing I didn't really cover is changing the title here for different organizations. So for example, maybe I want light inside this grouping of example here. I can just do example like that. So then it'll know to group light inside this example directory. So it's up to you how you organize that stuff. But yeah, at a high level, that's really most of what you need to get started. Now, there are a couple other things that's worth mentioning. Maybe I'll cover it in a follow-up video. Let me know in the comments if you're interested. But the testing section here is super interesting. You can add, like I mentioned earlier, I think you can add visual tests. You can do interaction tests. I'll probably definitely cover interaction tests in a follow-up video. But it's basically like using, for example, with React, you can use the React testing library to do your assertions. So let me show you some code real quick. So for example, in your story, you can actually provide a play function in here, and there's a version of testing library you'll see that's coming from Storybook, and you can use the same, a lot of this, it's basically the same syntax if you've ever used React testing library. So for example, they have this within function that allows you to hook into the rendered story, and then you can run assertions off of that story. Like for example, maybe you want to find a specific text, like maybe a label for an input, and then maybe you want to start typing into that input. So you can simulate user events, and then you can run your assertions of like, do things show up on the screen? Do things get removed? Does it enter some kind of state? So very, very powerful tool to have in your tool belt, in addition to just regular unit testing. But again, this is running off of a real DOM. So that's pretty powerful in my mind. And you can run these tests on the terminal as well. It just needs to have a running Storybook server to latch onto to actually run the tests. So again, maybe I'll cover this in a future video. And then one last thing that I would mention is take a look at the add-ons that you can add. There's a bunch coming from the community itself. So for example, one that I recommend for everybody, I think I mentioned earlier, is the accessibility add-on. And you just install that, and then it'll tell you, for example, here on the bottom, if you have potential accessibility violations, like maybe there's not enough contrast between your text color and your background color, things like that. It'll automatically just check it for you. So as an example here, you'll just install it, and then in that main.ts file that we had earlier, you just add it to your add-ons, and then it should automatically just show up on one of the tabs at the bottom panel. There's one here for designs. So for example, maybe you have a Figma design, you can actually add a configuration to your story so that the design shows up side by side with your story. So if you want to be able to like see your working implementation and the design at the bottom, that's what this is for. There's an add-on for MSW for if you want to have mock API calls. So maybe you need to work with dynamic data. You can simulate actually making API calls if you need to. Again, there's a bunch of other stuff in here that there's too much to cover in one video, but those are probably the two that I highly recommend, or three: accessibility, design, and MSW. Anyways, that's it for me today. If you want to learn more, let me know in the comments what you think I should cover. But everything that I covered here is honestly most of what you need to get started. So hopefully that helps you out. Anyways, yeah, that's it. Make sure to subscribe if you want to see more, leave a comment, and also like the video, and I'll see you on the next one.